Rancher lived alone for years until the Bigfoot left tracks, leading to his door. Before we begin, take a moment to comment your city. Where are you watching from today? And once the story is over, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The wind of Montana swept across a prairie buried in white, carrying with it the scent of fresh snow and the fading trace of last night's hearth fire. Somewhere far off, a lone harmonica moaned its notes, drifting into the steady, muffled thud of hooves, striking frozen ground, low and hollow, echoing through a fog-laced valley. Red winter dust mingled with shards of ice swirled in restless spirals along a narrow trail leading to a solitary ranch. The rancher pushed open the creaking wooden door, his breath blooming into pale clouds before his face, and then he froze. On the untouched snow before his porch, a line of massive footprints sank deep, perfectly straight, leading right to where he stood then, stopping. No turn back, no step away, just as if someone or something had been standing there all night watching him. In this country, snow has a way of covering everything, except that day. Montana early winter. The sky hung like a sheet of heavy gray steel, silent and unbroken. Across the high plains, the grass lay buried under ice, all the way to the base of the Sapphire Mountains, where the wind moaned through weathered fence posts. The dirt road to the ranch was nothing more than a faint shadow beneath fresh snow, no wagon ruts, no hoofprints. Elias Carter's place stood alone in that vast, white emptiness, a dark timbered house, with the stock barn on one side, the hay shed on the other. 47 years old, once a hired gun drifting through Wyoming and Dakota, Elias now lived by himself, surviving on his skill with a rifle and the work-worn strength of his hands to keep the land in his herd. He wasn't a man of many words, and he didn't need anyone prying with questions. This morning, like so many before it, Elias pulled on his wool coat, hefted a feed sack for the stock, and stepped out into snow that crunched like brittle glass beneath his boots. But here, where snow erased every trace, he saw something it could not hide. Right in the middle of the yard, pressed deep into the white, was a line of massive footprints, each more than twice the size of his own, sunk so far that the snow looked crushed under a terrible weight. They led straight to his porch, and then vanished. Elias stood frozen, one hand gripping the feed sack tight, a sharp stillness settling in his chest. It felt as if something had stepped into his world and shattered the silence he'd guarded for years. If you were living alone on a ranch like this, what would you do? Part 1. The first sign. The wind rolled down from the Sapphire Range, lashing across Elias Carter's face like the snap of an icy whip. On the ranch yard, fresh snow lay smooth to the far fence line, fine as sifted flour. Each step he took crunched under the worn soles of his leather boots, leaving neat, even prints behind. He bent down, breath spilling into a pale cloud before his eyes, then froze. Right there, pressed deep into the snow, was a footprint, not his and not from any creature he had ever hunted in his life. The foot was broad as a shovel blade, 5 toes clearly defined. No claws like a bear, no split hooves like deer or cattle. It measured close to 20 inches long and nearly as wide as his thigh. He shut one eye, comparing his calloused hand to it. His palm seemed small as a child's in the shadow of that print. Half-formed images flickered through his mind, settler tales of something that lived deep in the timber, strange bellows rolling across the valleys on moonless nights. He had never believed them, not until this morning. Elias left the open yard and began to follow the line of tracks toward the horse barn. He crouched over each one, measuring the gap nearly 4 feet from print to print, longer than any man's stride he'd known. The snow beneath each mark was compacted, hard-ringed with tiny shards of fractured ice, as if a crushing weight had ground through to the frozen crust below. The wind rattled the barn's tin roof, making him start. Instinctively, his hand went to the stock of the Winchester slung over his shoulder. 15 years ago, that reflex had saved him from a drunk pulling a knife in a Helena saloon. Now it was back not for a man, but for something he couldn't yet name. He remembered last summer, when a sudden dust storm tore across the prairie, scattering his herd. The sound of pounding hooves and his own gunfire had mingled in a desperate effort to drive them back. That was the last time his heart had hammered like this. Beyond the barn, the prints veered right, angling toward the stand of old pines. But strangely, there were no return tracks, only a path leading to the ranch and ending right at his porch. Elias knelt beside the final print just inches from the bottom step. He leaned close, drawing in a breath, a scent unlike earth horse or any familiar hide. It was musky, like wet skin left too long in the open air, laced with a faint, acrid tang like smoke from wood he couldn't place. He pressed his bare fingers into the hollow of the print. The snow there felt damper, colder than the rest, as if the weight had pressed down less than an hour ago. A shiver climbed his spine. Rising slowly, he scanned the yard, the roof line, the fence line, the thickets beyond. The valley was silent save for the dull clap of a loose barn door in the wind. For years he had grown used to that silence, the chosen solitude that kept him away from the chatter of town, from smoky poker nights, from any noise that wasn't his own. But this morning, the quiet felt different. It had a pulse, as though waiting for something to happen. A memory surfaced 17 years old following his father into a winter hunt. They'd found strange hoof marks near the Madison River marks from a moose twice the usual size. His father had told him, "Not everything bigger is worth hunting, Eli. Some things are best left where they are." He'd learned then that the West wasn't just guns and gold, it was also respect for the things you didn't understand. But these tracks, they had come straight to his home as if intent on breaking that unspoken distance. He sat on the porch step, pulling off his glove to let bare skin meet the biting air. His fingers brushed the small scar in the Winchester's stocka mark from the day he'd used it to drive off wolves and save a passing traveler. That feeling standing on the thin edge between killing and saving came back now, but this time he didn't know who or what he might be facing. The wind shifted, blowing from the forest, carrying a sound so faint it almost vanished in the gust. Not a growl. Not exactly the crack of breaking wood. More like breathing deep, heavy, threaded through the whistle of the wind. Elias shot to his feet, eyes fixed on the trail into the timber. For a heartbeat, he swore he saw a massive shape blurred in the mist, then gone as if it had never been. His grip tightened on the Winchester, though he didn't raise it. Instead, he backed into the porch's shadow, eyes locked on that ghostly trail. If you were standing here on this frozen yard staring into that gray, waiting forest, what would you do? Part 2. Tracking the trail. The wind off the Sapphire Range cut across Elias Carter's face like the lash of a frozen whip. Beneath his boots, the fresh, unbroken snow was marred only by a single line of massive footprints running straight from his porch into the timber. He pulled his wool coat tight, adjusted the scarf at his neck, and kept his eyes on the deep impressions as if they'd been driven down by the weight of a full freight horse. At the gate, he paused and glanced back at the familiar yard, the horse barn, the hay shed, the silvered fence line, all standing still, almost as if they were watching him go. He left Brimstone behind, not wanting the sound of hoofbeats to shatter the uneasy quiet. He moved at a slow, deliberate pace, each breath blooming into a ghost-white cloud, each step carrying him into ground that felt untraveled. The dirt road that in summer burned red with dust was now a pale ribbon vanishing into the mist of the old pine forest. On either side, bare aspen branches rattled faintly, their dry creak carrying through the stillness. Elias crouched to measure a print longer than 2 handspans, nearly as wide as his thigh. No claws, no split hoof, just 5 blunt, rounded toes pressed into the snow like a giant hand turned to walk. Not a bear, not a man, and certainly nothing he'd tracked in all his years across Montana. His fingers tightened on the strap of the Winchester, the motion as automatic as drawing breath. The last time he'd felt this tightness in his gut was during a sudden dust storm when the herd had stampeded in blind panic. That day had been chaos in sound and motion. Today's chaos was buried in silence. The tracks drew him down a trail he knew well, the same path he'd driven cattle along toward the western pasture. But today something else had taken it first. Beside a lodgepole pine, the bark had been stripped fresh, the gouge starting nearly twice the height of his head. He tilted his chin upward. The break had to be at least 8 feet off the ground. No moose, no grizzly could reach that high on all fours. Farther in, more branches showed the same violence, thick as his wrist, twisted and snapped clean as if by a hand stronger than any axe. Resin bled in slow, sticky drops, giving off a sharp tang that mingled with his breath in the cold. Elias stopped. These weren't the marks of something running or hunting. These were the marks of something moving through its own territory, calm, assured, unchallenged. From far off, a single gunshot cracked. It rolled through the timber, fading across layers of trees before dying away. The sound carried with it a memory, barrooms falling silent after a single shot rang out. The forest now felt the same, still but wound tight. Another few hundred yards brought him into a shallow hollow walled by rock and roofed over with interlaced pine boughs. At its center lay an oval patch of flattened snow ringed with a few coarse black hairs thick as wet rope. He bent, lifted one. The scent was musky, edged with the faint bite of charred wood. The depression beneath was damp, the cold heavier there, a sign whatever had made it had left only recently. Elias held his breath and tilted his head to listen. The wind slid down from the ridge, but beneath it was a low, steady rhythm, not quite the moan of the pines, not quite the growl of an animal, more like breathing, slow, heavy. His palm found the Winchester's stock but didn't lift it. His father's voice came back to him from boyhood. Not everything big needs shooting, Eli. Some things are best left where they are, but this morning, it had stepped out of where it was, and it had left its mark at his very doorstep. The forest shifted into stands of ancient fir and spruce, their canopies so dense they swallowed most of the daylight. Elias's pace slowed, not only because the snow now reached halfway up his calves, but because of what he began to see along the way. Hanging from a low spruce branch at the trail's mouth was a loop of young willow loosely braided with strips of bark and tied off with wild grass. It turned lazily in a thin breath of wind, not a decoration, not a snare. Elias circled it without touching, only watching. He'd seen the seasonal charms of native tribes, the boundary markers of sheep herders, the warning signs left by hunters. But this was different. It felt like a symbol neither threatening nor welcoming, more like a pause in a sentence, a sign saying, "Pass through." He stepped beneath the willow loop. Inside, the snow deepened, and the massive footprints ran straight as rails ahead. To either side, stones were stacked in rough little piles, branches were twisted together like braids, and on a flat slab of rock, a small tuft of deer hair had been laid square in the center. None of it was scattered or accidental. Everything here had been placed. The air shifted. The cold was still there, but now a different weight pressed across his shoulders, the same pressure he'd felt standing in a bull ring, or when a stranger in a saloon eased his hand onto a gunstock. No words needed saying. He knew he'd stepped into a place ruled by another law. Deeper in, the signs grew sharper. On a thick fir trunk nearly 3 meters off the ground were 4 parallel gouges, each as deep as the first joint of his finger. The spacing was that of massive fingers. Beside them was the print of a thumb offset as clear and heavy as a brand. Elias stood at the base, tilting his head back. Snow shook loose from a high bough, melting against the wool collar of his coat. The stillness here was so complete, he could hear the slow, heavy thump of his own heart. Almost under his breath, he murmured, "You've been here before, reading the same land I do." The words went unanswered, vanishing into air touched only by the faint sigh of wind moving through the forest canopy like a harmonica played far away. Elias went on each step, landing neatly inside the giant tracks, as if binding him to a story much older than himself. Through a narrow cut in the rock, the trees suddenly gave way to a wide clearing of snow, a frozen creek running through its middle. On the ice lay a bull moose brought down cleanly, so clean Elias knew at once it wasn't the kill of any predator he'd tracked. Around the carcass, the huge prints formed a ring, some new and sharp over older ones. Beside the body, 2 ribs had been set parallel atop the ice. The arrangement wasn't animal. It had order, intention. Elias moved slower now, Winchester low at his side. Then, at the clearing's far edge, the dark boughs stirred, shifting as something enormous moved behind them. He held his breath, and then he saw it. Not in full, but enough to make his pulse drop to a heavy, deliberate beat. a towering shape shoulders wide as a barn door covered head to toe in thick, dark hair standing half hidden among the trunks. Even at this distance, Elias felt the weight of its gaze like it could see straight through him. It didn't advance, just watched. Then it turned walking with slow, deliberate steps deeper into the forest. Before it vanished, it stopped planted one great foot in the snow and left behind a single clear print, an invitation or a warning. Elias stood at the edge of the clearing, eyes locked on that fresh trail leading into shadow. Every instinct told him to turn back, bolt the door, and go on living the solitary life he knew. But something else, a part of him long dormant, wanted to follow, to seek the answer to a question no one had ever asked him. He drew in a deep breath, fingers tightening on the Winchester's stock, then letting go. One step, then another, sinking neatly into the giant's path. The trees closed around him and the pale winter light was swallowed whole. If you stood here at the clearing's edge, staring at a trail that led into darkness, would you follow? Or would you turn back? Part 3. The uneasy night fell faster than it should have. The Montana sky was swallowed by a heavy quilt of black cloud, no stars, no moon, only the hiss of wind threading through the gaps in the siding like someone whispering outside the door. Elias Carter sat in the small kitchen, the oil lamp on the table casting a thin amber glow, too weak to push back the shadows pooling in the corners. The coffee in his cup had long gone cold untouched. Across the table lay his Winchester, the round already chambered. The front door was barred, but Elias knew if it wanted in those planks might as well be paper. From outside, the barn gave a faint clink of hooves on wood. Brimstone had heard something. Elias rose, moving slow toward the window, and eased the curtain aside. The yard lay under a sheet of unbroken snow, until a dark shape slid past the edge of his sightline, heavy, deliberate. He didn't flip on the porch light. Out here sometimes light was the wrong kind of invitation. Then came the footsteps, deep, measured thuds circling the ranch. Each one sank into the snow with a weight that carried through the timbers, lodging in the bones of the house. Elias felt them not just in his ears, but in his chest. He eased back into the center of the room, every nerve tuned to the silence that followed, until 3 more steps fell closer now. The cadence was the same as the trail he'd tracked that morning. A gust slammed over the roof, drawing a long whistle through the siding. But underneath that wind, there was breathing, slow, heavy, so deep it felt like the floorboards trembled. Elias wasn't a man who scared easy. He'd ridden through dust storms to round up a panicked herd, stood alone at the edge of town when strangers with gun hands drifted in. But tonight was different. This felt like more than a threat. It felt like a summons. Elias shrugged into his wool coat, slung the cartridge belt over his shoulder, and reached for the oil lamp. The flame inside quivered as he opened the door, spilling a narrow ribbon of gold across the porch, only to have it swallowed almost instantly by the thick, waiting dark. The night air bit at his skin like shards of ice. Each breath billowed into a white cloud, curling into the ground fog that clung low over the snow. The footsteps stopped the moment the door opened, leaving a silence so tight it made every instinct in him sharpen. He stepped down from the porch, the snow squealing under his boots. Just a few yards away beside the fence line stood a shape too large to mistake, taller than any man, near twice his height, shoulders wide enough to block the rails behind it. No clear outline, just a shadow, darker than the dark around it. The lamp in his hand tilted slightly, the light catching on 2 faintly glowing eyes, golden embers that did not blink. They regarded each other across the frost and the fog. Elias didn't raise his rifle. He didn't back away. For a moment he was back by some long-ago campfire, listening to old men speak of things that weren't meant to be hunted, only left alone. The dark shape drew in a slow breath. Elias heard the snow crunch beneath its weight, each shift of its stance carrying an unspoken message. I am here, and I am heavy enough to matter. Yet it didn't advance. It simply stood, those eyes fixed on him as if weighing something unseen. A gust tore through the yard, rocking the lamp in his grip. When the light steadied, the shadow was retreating, folding into the mist. The fence trembled in its wake, and the loose boards whispered with the memory of its passing. Elias turned toward the porch, but the lamp's glow swept across something that stopped him cold at the foot of the steps. Less than a hand's breadth from his boot was a fresh, massive footprint. The snow around it was pristine, but inside the print it glistened wet beneath the light like it had been pressed there only a few breaths ago. He crouched, bare hand brushing down into it. The cold bit at his skin. But beneath it lingered warmth, the faint heat left by whatever had stood there. Lifting his head, he stared toward the fence where the shadow had vanished. The silence was total, broken only by the slow, deliberate drum of his own heart. In his mind, two roads opened: bolt the door and sleep with the Winchester beside the bed, or follow the trail now in the dead of night and learn exactly what shared this land with him. Elias stepped back once, then blew out the lamp. Darkness swallowed the porch whole, but that footprint remained burned into his thoughts, glowing brighter than any flame. If you were Elias standing over a print still warm in the midnight snow, would you follow it? Or lock the door behind you? Part 4. The moment of confrontation. At first light, the eastern woods lay beneath a thick white veil. Fog clung to every pine branch, poured down the slopes, and wrapped itself around the frozen meadow. Elias Carter stood at the edge of his ranch yard, Winchester slung over one shoulder, collar of his wool coat turned high against the cold. All through the night, he'd slept in broken fragments, ears straining for any sound. The footprint beneath the porch was still there, now glazed over with a thin layer of frost clinging to the snow. The pale light of morning seemed unwilling to push too far into the timber, but Elias was. He stepped down, crossed the fence, and followed the familiar trail toward the forest's edge. Each step pressed a muffled crunch into the snow, the sound hanging in the gray emptiness. Here the wind eased, but the fog thickened dense enough to feel like stepping into some vast, silent chamber that had been waiting for him. The first sound came quiet, the faint snap of a dry twig. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't careless. Whoever or whatever was moving wanted him to hear it. Elias stopped, one hand settling onto the rifle's stock. Ahead, the curtain of mist shifted, not from wind, but from the slow, deliberate advance of something large. Pine boughs trembled, releasing soft cascades of snow that drifted down in pale clouds. Elias drew in a deep breath, heart pounding slow but hard. He remembered the old days on the Wyoming range when a wall of dust would rise from the horizon, stampeding cattle in a wild frenzy, and he'd have to stand in their path, bracing for the surge. The feeling was the same, now facing a force far greater than himself, and knowing it would not stop simply because he willed it to. A shadow began to take shape within the fog, tall, broad, moving with a slow, measured certainty. The shadow moved through the fog, as if the entire forest shifted aside to make room for it. And then it was there. Bigfoot. Its shoulders were as broad as a barn door, the massive frame cloaked in a dense coat of fur, streaked in browns, grays, and blacks blending perfectly with the bark and shadows. Its arms hung long, nearly to its knees, hands as large as the grain shovels Elias used in the feed-shed fingers, thick, strong, and sure. Every step it took pressed twice as deep into the snow as Elias's own. But it was the eyes that held him still. They were not the eyes of a predator, nor the wild, rolling eyes of a spooked animal. They were steady, deep, calm, as if weighing him, not as an intruder, but as part of the landscape itself. Less than 20 meters separated them. Elias didn't raise the rifle. His hand had already slipped from the stock, resting loose at his side. One thought rose clear in his mind. Some things, if you've seen them, that's enough. They stood in the hush, neither advancing nor retreating. Only Bigfoot's slow, heavy breaths mingled with the mist, and Elias's own quicker but measured. Time seemed to unspool from the moment until nothing existed but this silent taut as a bowstring. Elias understood this wasn't a meeting to be won or lost. It was a test. Bigfoot tilted its head, almost as if committing his shape to memory. Then, with a slow draw of breath, it turned, striding back into the trees. But before disappearing, it stopped, planted one massive foot deliberately in the snow, and left a single fresh print pointing deeper into the dark. Elias moved toward it, each step deliberate. The new print was deep, its hollow still damp, as if holding onto the last trace of warmth. He stood over it, eyes fixed on the place where the towering figure had vanished. The wind shifted, stirring the pine boughs and pushing the fog just enough for him to catch a fleeting shape. Still there, not fleeing, not gone. Waiting. Watching. He knew that stepping into this print meant leaving behind the safe boundaries he'd lived within for years. But he also knew that turning back would leave this moment unfinished, a story that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Elias bent, set his boot neatly inside the giant track, and tightened his grip on the Winchester's worn stock. Lifting his head, he walked into the darkness where Bigfoot had gone. The wind sighed through the forest edge, carrying with it a faint, lonely note like a harmonica played far, far away. If you stood at the forest's edge with a trail of giant footprints leading into the dark, would you follow them or turn away? Part 5. The choice to follow. The trail into the forest narrowed until even two men walking side by side would have to turn their shoulders. On either side rose the trunks of old pines, their low boughs heavy with mist. Underfoot, fresh snow mingled with the mottled browns of fallen leaves, making a patchwork carpet across the ground. Bigfoot's tracks stood out sharp against the white, each stride more than 5 feet apart, leading deeper into country Elias had never set foot in. Each time he followed, he had to stretch his leg long, planting the toe of his boot neatly inside the print left before him like trying on the boots of a giant. The crunch of snow beneath his soles mixed with the dry whisper of leaves carrying through the fogged air. Now and then came the crack of a branch high overhead, or the faint thud of something heavy moving somewhere ahead, far enough to keep out of sight but close enough to remind him he was not alone. Elias thought of the winter hunts near Helena, the echo of rifle fire rolling across open ground, herds of elk breaking into wild flight like water spilling down a slope. Back then, he had been the hunter. Now, he wasn't sure if he was tracking or walking straight into the sightline of something else. The prints led him past strange signs. A birch trunk bent low to the ground, held in place as if some great hand had pressed it there. Stones the size of a man's skull stacked in a tight spiral by the trail's edge, with a single weathered elk antler laid in the center like an offering. Elias stopped to study it. This wasn't nature's doing, and it wasn't any trap or trail marker known to the men of the West. This felt like a language just not one meant for people. He crouched and touched the antler. Ice cold. When he looked up again through the shifting haze, a patch of darkness was moving. Slowly, deliberately. Elias's heart skipped, not from fear, but from the knowledge that he'd already stepped too far to turn back. Elias kept moving, and the deeper he went, the more the sense of tracking began to feel like being led. The footprints no longer ran in a straight line. They curved with intention, weaving between rock outcrops, skirting thick bramble, avoiding slick hollows where snow had crusted over. This was no path for the hurried. It felt chosen, designed to bring him to a particular place. The wind moved gently here, but it didn't carry the raw bite of the open prairie. Instead, it brought the faint tang of old wood smoke mingled with damp earth and that musky, almost animal scent he'd caught in the footprints yesterday. And then Elias knew this wasn't happenstance. It wanted him to sense its presence step by step. He thought of the look in the eyes of travelers first stepping into a frontier town, cautious, half suspicious, half hopeful for a place to rest. Now he wore that look himself, not toward a person, but toward the shadows ahead. The trail brought him to the base of a massive pine, its roots knotted above the earth like the coils of some great serpent. Resting on those roots lay an object that stopped him cold, his brother's hunting knife lost years ago on a botched elk hunt. The walnut handle still bore the Carter engraving, worn but legible. The steel was cold to the touch, but not rusted, preserved as if someone had cared for it. Elias closed his fingers around it, and for an instant it was as though his brother's hand had closed over his own. He lifted his head, scanning the misted timber. Nothing moved, yet the massive print stretched onward as if saying, "There's more yet to see." A gust wound through the treetops, spinning a handful of dry leaves in a slow circle before him. Elias drew in a long breath and realized he'd stopped thinking about turning back. The trail brought him to a narrow mountain pass, two sheer rock faces standing like the doors of the earth itself. Beyond them was darkness, dense and unmoving, broken only by faint silver glimmers, where snow caught what little light reached inside. Elias stood at the threshold. Behind him lay the safe road back to the ranch, its roof, its lamplight, its steady, unchanging routines. Ahead lay a road where each step could lead him to the truth, or leave him never to return. He bent once more, planting his boot inside the giant's track. It fit so loosely, it might as well have been a child's foot inside a giant's boot. His grip on the Winchester tightened, not from fear, but as a reminder of the man he still was. Then he stepped through the stone gate. The wind from beyond surged around him, carrying a deep, low sound like harmonica notes, swept far away by the current. There was no more dawn light here, only the scent of earth resin and the silent invitation of a legendary being. Elias's shadow merged with the dark ahead. The footprints continued vanishing into a place no one had ever told a story about. If you were Elias standing before such a natural doorway, knowing you'd leave safety behind, would you step through the end? The forest fog was thick as water, swallowing Elias Carter's shape as he pushed deeper in. The last pale threads of a winter morning clung to his coat, then slipped away, leaving only darkness and the soft crunch of snow under each step. The giant tracks ahead stretched on, steady and unbroken, leading between century-old pines through narrow stone cuts across patches of forest, so silent that Elias could hear the drum of his own heartbeat. At a bend in the trail, he stopped. Hanging from a pine branch just off the path was something small, a faded red scarf embroidered with a six-pointed star. Elias knew it instantly, his mother's scarf lost when he was still a boy. He'd always believed it had been swept away in the spring floods years ago. His hand trembled as he touched the worn fabric. There was no explanation, no figure to hand it back, only the trail of footprints waiting patient for him to go on. Elias gave a small nod, tucking the scarf into the inside pocket of his coat, then stepped forward again. He understood now this path wouldn't hand him an easy answer, but it would change the way he saw everything that remained of his life. The fog closed behind him. The darkness opened ahead, and somewhere in the deep timber, a harmonica's note rose again, uncertain if it was born of wind or of a living hand. Some footprints don't just lead to a place. They lead into the story of a lifetime. If you saw giant tracks right outside your door, what would you do? Share your thoughts. If you were the rancher, would you have stayed or ridden away into the wild? Let me know in the comments.